This is a true story. An American man was visiting a canyon, fell while climbing a mountain. His right hand happened to get caught in a rockfall during the fall. It then stuck him in a narrow, cramped rock crevice. He was more shocked than hurt. I guess that's what happens when you win the lottery. Anyway, let's pull it out. But he couldn't pull it out. Then he decided to lift. Harder. But he couldn't lift it. He kicks it with his foot. He pushes with his back. He hit it with all his strength. But it was as if the stone was set in place. It didn't move at all. He fought for minutes, until he finally ran out of steam. Next, he starts shouting for help. But by coincidence, he came to a canyon in the middle of nowhere. It's 1,000 miles of wilderness, not to mention the lack of people, and the lack of signal. Oh, yes. And he didn't have a mobile phone, and, yes, he hadn't told anyone that he was coming here. It's true what they say, if you don't do it, you won't die. And when he calmed down, he said, I don't want to die, but I have to save myself. First step, get all your gear out. A watch, a water bottle, sunglasses, rope, DVD, utility knife. Step 2. See what works. Water, of course, is the most important thing, but it's only about 500 milliliters. It'll last you a week. The utility knife is by far the most useful, so the third step is to chisel. However, it didn't take long for him to get sore hands. He'd been chiseling for hours, but he couldn't get a single chip out, and then he accidentally, and the knife fell into a crack in the ground. He shouted SHIT, and it was a disaster. He tries to reach out and pick it up. Where could he get it? He took off his shoes. He tries to pick it up with his bare feet, but he can't. Then he pinches a twig with his foot and tries to hook it. Still no luck. The next time he twisted the branch and snapped it. He made a small hook, and finally, he lifts the knife up, so happy, but he soon realizes that the blade is dull. He had to sharpen it as he chiseled. This stone is very hard-wearing. It was 12 o'clock in the morning. He was already thirsty. Finally he takes the bottle of water and carefully drinks a little. He holds it in his mouth and swallows it slowly. This is the reward for persevering on the first day. After drinking the water, he thinks it's time to go to bed, but he can't sleep with his hand hanging over him. He had to find a way, throwing the rope upwards dozens of times, so that the rope hooks onto the bumps of the rock. He then fastened the loop around his waist. He can then sleep by the rock. Then he could sleep by the rock. Within 5 minutes he's awake. He kept grinding, and so on, until the sun came up. Stone for 24 hours. His hands were already blue-gray in color. It was useless to save it, but what worries him more now is that he had only about 300 milliliters of water left, and would not last more than a few days. He had stopped sharpening the stone, because the sharper the knife, the harder the stone, the more dull it became. It was not going to work. At night, he unpacked the dry food he had brought with him. He ate in small bites. After eating, he drank a little water, not daring to drink more. He carefully took off his contact lenses and put them in his mouth. He didn't pee for the rest of the day. On the third day, he continued to try his best to. He wrapped an elastic cord around the stone several times. The rope was attached to the top of the post by a spring-loaded buckle to make a fixed pulley. Good physics. However, whether he wrapped it around his hand and pulled, or wrapped around his feet and stepped on them with all his strength, the stone didn't even shake. After all this work, it was all for nothing. Desperate, his mind is filled with water. Drink, beer. At last he couldn't resist. Opened his water bottle, and took a small sip. Then he suddenly felt the urge to pee. He pulled down his trousers and peed in one go. It was probably due to the lack of water in his body that caused the problem. The second time he learned his lesson, and peed into the water bag. Maybe that would help next. At dusk this day he summed it up for the camera. His fixed pulley didn't work because the rope was stretchy. He only had 150 milliliters of water left. It would only last until tomorrow night. Then, he finds the straw of his water bag was wrapped in a cotton woven bag. It was a good tourniquet. In fact, inside he knew what the only way was. He wrapped this tourniquet around his right hand, then used a spring-loaded buckle to pull it ever tighter and tighter. Then he took out his utility knife and started cutting his hand, but it was so dull that he couldn't even cut the skin. It couldn't even cut through the skin. He was already very weak and groggy. He drank some water and accidentally knocked over his water bottle. Much of the precious water was wasted. In a moment of desperation, he remembers his ex-girlfriend to make himself feel better inside. Suddenly, lightning flashes, and it's about to rain. He hurriedly opened his mouth and opened his water bottle to catch the water. The rain fell more and more and instantly integrated into small rivers, which began to flood and pour into the crevices of the hill. Soon the water came up slowly and flooded over his head. He pushed hard against the rock in the water. The stone was pushed away, and he was free. He rushed back to his car. He drove all the way to his ex-girlfriend's house. He tried to get her back, but he couldn't make a sound. His ex-girlfriend slammed the door. He woke up in tears. It was a dream. He was still in this canyon of nightmares. On the fourth day, he drank the last of the water. There was no more water. His heart was beating fast, and he was shivering with cold. Death had knocked at the door. He decided not to wait any longer. Stabbed himself in the arm with a vengeance, but the knife was blocked by bone. The bone wouldn't cut through. He had to pull it out. He tasted some blood. It didn't quench his thirst. He had to drink urine. The smell made him sick. He coughed for a long time after drinking it. It quenched his thirst. Another night passed. He was on the verge of death. The visions kept coming. One of them was particularly strange. A couch appeared in the cave. His family and friends were all sitting on the couch. What does this mean? He stopped thinking about it. It was time. He started to push. What for? To break his right hand. In excruciating pain, he finally breaks a bone in his arm. Then he kept pushing. Harder. The second bone is broken too. He laughed out loud and wiped away his tears. He took out his knife and started to cut his own arm. He finally cut his own arm. Down it came. In the true story, the process lasted over an hour. He took a moment to slow down, then bandaged his arm, packed up his things and left. Before leaving, he couldn't resist picking up his camera to take a picture of the broken arm. He navigates through the narrow rock crevices. Soon he finds light. He finally gets some sun. He was so happy, looking down, and there was water. Dirty water, even for him. It was like a jelly. But how could he go down 10 meters? Suddenly he saw a hook and loop left by his predecessor. He smiled. He kissed it. Then he dropped himself with the elastic rope and spring clasp. Little by little he went down, walking to the water's edge. He plunged his whole body into the water. He drank from the water as long as he could, drinking on his back, drinking by licking, drinking from a water bottle. And when he's almost done, he left everything behind. Just take the water bottle and move on. It's a big canyon, but he's got a pair of feet. It's a hand for a hand. He stumbles on for hours. He runs out of water. He gets dizzy as he walks. He falls down, gets up and keeps walking. Finally, he sees someone in front of him. He shouted out with the last of his strength. The people came running towards him. He was saved. Dazed and confused, he said he cut off his hand, wanted some water. The other man gave him water. He gulped it down. He drank it and moved on. The second group came. He continued to drink. Finally he sat down on the ground, exhausted. People speak to him. He was unable to respond until the wind blew and the dust flew. He lifted his head. Here comes the helicopter. The man encountered a stone destined to kill him, but he survived a hellish ordeal and earned the right to live. One day, much later, he saw his family and friends sitting together on the sofa watching him. It had been his vision. Now it was real.